What's up guys? So in this video I'm going to show you how to use the Prisma ORM, and it's this new Prisma that's been popping off recently, and as you see here it's for Node.js and TypeScript, but I believe that you can also use it for JavaScript. And in my opinion it's one of the best ORMs that have come out as of recent, and if we look here in npm trends, it gets a relatively low amount of downloads compared to Sequelize or TypeORM. But if you take a close look, ever since the beginning of 2021, it's just started to increase in popularity significantly. And I really believe that over time it's going to pass TypeORM in popularity. And that would be because TypeORM is not really being maintained anymore. I mean, the last update here was 2 months ago, and for Prisma it was 2 days ago. So that should just tell you everything you need to know. But anyways, let's just jump right into it then. I'm just going to go over here to VSCode, and I'm going to show you how you can get started. So we're going to create like this API thing with Express, and it's just going to be a dumb little API so we can actually learn how to use Prisma. So the first thing you need to do is actually install a couple of things as dependencies. So obviously we need TypeScript in here. We need TS Node in here so we can run our TypeScript. We're also going to need the types for Node. And we're gonna actually need to install Prisma itself, and these will all be dev dependencies, so you put this -D flag on it. And also we're gonna install Express in here, and we're gonna need the types for that too. So you want to do @type/express because we are going to be using TypeScript here. Okay, now that that's done, I'm going to use yarn, but you can use npx for this command as well. I'm going to do yarn prisma init, and this is going to initialize a Prisma application. So it created a Prisma folder with this schema, and this is basically the foundation of our schema for Prisma. And basically how Prisma works is that you define your database in this schema file right here, and then it just handles the rest for you. You just type in a quick command and it creates your database, and you'll see just how useful everything comes together. So in this .env file is where we need to specify our database URL. So right now, if you log into PSQL, and I'm gonna list my databases, we actually need to create a database for this project. So I'm just gonna do create DB and call it Prisma. And so here, I can put in my user, my password, leave that the same, and here I put Prisma, and then it'll connect to the database automatically. So here's your username, here's your password for PostgreSQL, and here is your host, in our case is localhost, here's the port, and then here you put the name of your database. And so the next thing you want to do is actually create a tsconfig file. So to do that, we will do npx tsc --init, and so that'll create us a TypeScript file. And so over here in the documentation, here they state the requirements that you need to have in the TypeScript file. So we need to have source map set to true. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to search for source map until I find it, and here it was. So I'm going to uncomment that, and that's set to true. And we need out directory set to dist. I don't really know if that's required or they just put it in there, but we're gonna follow that. We're gonna follow their instructions because, you know, they made the library, so they should know what they're doing. Okay, so there, and then strict is set to true. Here it already is set to true, and then the lib, the library. So here, up here, we want to set this to ES next. Then ES module interop set to true, and it's already set to true. So this is everything that we needed to configure. And personally, I like to configure a little bit more. I like to have a little bit more of a stricter configuration. So I like to go down here and strict null checks, function types, all this stuff. I like having that. I like all that stuff, and there. It just makes it a little bit more strict. Okay, so now let's actually get started on the schema, which will actually control the tables in our database. So over here in this Prisma folder, in schema.prisma, here we define our database. So all you gotta do is go down here and declare a model. And obviously you gotta give a name to the model. We're gonna call our user. So we're gonna define a user, which is tied to a table in our database. The first thing we gotta do is create the primary key of our table. So I'm gonna call it ID. It's gonna be an integer, and then you just do @id, and this just declares that this is the primary key. Then you do @default, and this is how you set a default value to this, and we're gonna set it to auto increment. So next thing we want is, let's say we want to have a name for users, or a username. So we're gonna do username string like that, and if you do a question mark, that means that this is an optional field, but if you leave it out, that means that this cannot be null, that this is required. So we just want to set it like that. Then we put a bio and set it to a string and question mark. And by the way, I'm getting syntax highlighting here because I have the Prisma extension over here, right here. You don't have to worry about that because the first time you open a .prisma file, it'll VS Code will automatically recommend the extension to you. It'll show a little pop-up for you to install it. And let's actually create our first relationship. So let's say each one of our users has a car. And I know this doesn't really make sense, but it's the first thing I thought of. So let's create a relation where each one of our users has a car. So for that, we will need to make a model called car. And then here we can define the ID, which is the same thing as up here. So I'm just going to copy it down. Then we want the model. And then this would be a string, right? And if you're wondering, how can I make it so that there's a maximum amount of length allowed? You can do @db.varchar. And then in here, it's like creating a varchar in a database, if you're familiar with that. And then you put in the max amount of characters allowed. So this would be, let's say like 100, right? And then over here in the username, we can do the same thing. So db.varchar, varchar, and then let's say 40. We don't want no one with username more than 40. And then let's say over here, the same thing. So we don't need people with a bio more than 150 characters. And so let's say the relationship is that one user can have many cars, but one car can only have one user. So to do that, you would just go here and say cars, so the name of the column, and then you would say it will be an array of cars. And so then down here, you want to set the relation. So each car should have one user. So you can do user, and it's a user. So you give it the type of user. And here's where you specify the relation. So you do @relation, and then you do fields, and it gives you an array. And then you do references, and it gives you another array. So the field is, let's say, where are we storing this relationship? So here we need to make a column called user ID, and this would be an integer. And then here we store the user ID in this user ID field. So we specify user ID. And then we have to put references ID. So what this basically says is we're storing a user. So we want to access this model, and we're storing their ID from here in this field called user ID. So whenever we try to query and access the user, it's going to Prisma will automatically know to look in the user ID, and that it's going to reference this ID in the user model, and it sets up that relationship for us automatically. So now that we've made our schema, we need to update our database so it can have this schema. Now there's two ways to do that. One would be by doing migrations, and one would be by doing the command db push. So migrations is basically a way to keep track of all the changes you've made to your database, and that'll make it so that your database is always up to date no matter what computer you're on. And that's really useful when you're working on a team, or maybe you're working by yourself and you're using something like GitHub. So over here on their documentation, we're gonna go here, and here they tell us when do you use migrations and when do you use the command db push. db push basically just pushes this schema into your database. That's all it does. So DB push is for prototyping, and you should use it when you first make your application, and they recommend to just use that until you have a stable version of your database, and then that's when you would make your first migration. So I'm going to show you basically what that is. So here we would go yarn Prisma DB push, and it'll get this schema and update our database for us. So now when I go into PSQL and I connect to the Prisma database, I'm going to do the command \DT. So here we see that we have a car table and a user table. Let's say that we want to make a change to it. So let's say I want cars to actually be cars, because it's weird to have a table called car when we're actually storing more than one car in there. Same thing with the users table. And that's pretty simple, and that's the next thing I wanted to show you how to do. So you'd go here and do @map, and then it's a function, and as a string you pass in the name of your table. So I want my table to be called users, but I want it to reference it in Prisma by .user. And so I would do the same thing down here, but name it cars. And so now we've made a change to our database schema. So, and let's say we have a stable version of the database and we want to start tracking this in GitHub, and we want to have these migration files to track this. So now all we got to do is run yarn or npx prisma migrate dev. Since we're in development, we do migrate dev. And here I tell you that we need to reset the database because this is actually our first migration. And that's why they recommend to only use DB push when you're prototyping, because with your first migration, it'll delete all the data in your database. So here you want to put yes, of course, and you need a name for this migration. So I'll just put initial migration right here. And then that's it. And then here we have this file called migrations, and it has another file with at the end of it, it says initial migration. And here we have an SQL file, and here it contains the schema of our table. And every time we make a change to this, it's going to create a new folder with those changes, with those SQL commands in that file. So now that we have that done, let's actually start creating our API so we can test all of this out. So I'm going to create a folder called source, and inside of here, index.ts. And then I'm going to create a script over here. And so I actually forgot to run yarn init, but that's not going to matter in our case. So I'm just going to make some scripts here. And the first one's going to call dev, and it's just going to run nodemon on my source.index.ts. And so now I can just run yarn dev, and it'll run the TypeScript file. And let's test these things out by doing a little console log hi from ts, and we see we're getting that down here, so everything's working fine. So the first thing we want to do is import express. So we're going to import express from express, and then we're going to do const app is equal to express. So this is not an express tutorial, I'm assuming you already know what this is. So we're going to do app.listen on port 4000. We get a callback, and we do app listening on port 4000. So there we have our app listening on port 4000, and let's start taking in some requests. Our requests are going to be received in JSON, so we need to do app.use express.json. So down here we can do app.post, and let's say we want to make a path where users can create a user. So we do here /create_user. We get a request, and this will be a type of request. We get a response, type of response. So now we're actually going to start using Prisma. So in order to do that, we need to instantiate an instance of the Prisma client. So here we do const Prisma is equal to new Prisma client, like that. And so now we can do const new user is equal to await prisma.user.create. And then it takes in an object, and here we have some nice autocomplete. So first we specify the data of our user, and here we get this nice autocomplete of our model. So it requires a username, and we can get that from the body. So we can do const username is equal to we destructure that. So username is equal to request.body, like that. And so we pass in the username here. Here we get more autocomplete, so we can specify bio, cars, ID. So let's say we want to include a car. So let's say we want to create a car, and that's from our other model in our database, but since it's connected to our user, we can create them together. So here we'll do create, and then we can specify the properties of our car, or we can do create many, and then data again. And here we can specify more than one car. So this create many would take this data, and this data is in array, like that. And then you pass in an array of objects, and it can take in a model. So let's say here Chevy. And then the next one, let me format this so you can actually read it. The next one would be another object with another model of Toyota. So that's how we can create those things. And after we do all of this, we would go here, and I'm just going to console log our new user when they're created. And then we would want to send back a response. And I'll send back the new user actually instead of logging it to the console. So now all we need to do is include this username in our request. So I'm going to go over here to Postman, and I'm going to send a request to HTTP localhost 4000/ create_user, and I'm gonna stick in the body some raw JSON with a username of Bob. Okay, so when I send this, I should get a response. Oh yeah, it's a post request, my bad. Okay, so let's try again. Okay, so now let me try again, and let me make this a string because it's supposed to be a string. So let me send this post request to create a user. So here we get back our user. So it has an ID of 1, username of Bob, and no bio because we didn't specify a bio. And over here, when we do a new user, it only includes our user. It doesn't include all the relationships. We can actually change that by over here doing include, and we could include cars, and it will be true. So let's create another user, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm going to create another one called Alice. And see here, not only did we get the ID of 2 and their username and their bio, but we got all the cars that they own. So each car had an ID for that specific car in the table. It had a model, and it had a user ID which is tied to a user account. So you can see just how easy it is to make powerful queries using Prisma. So you saw how we can create a user. Now let's just make a quick little endpoint to get a specific user. So I'm going to do app.get, and it's going to be called get user. Takes in a request with type of request, response, type of response. Oops, not request, response. And here we're going to make this asynchronous. We're going to do const user equals await prisma.user dot, and then we can do find first, and then it takes in an object, and you do where, and that's another object, and you can do where ID is equal to request.body.id, and then we can do res.json user. And let's say we want to get all of their cars as well, so we can do here include cars. It's true. So now we're going to get a user and all of their cars. So now over here, when I do a get request, and I named it get user, and here was ID, and here I type in say 1. Here we get Bob. So I'm not sure if you see this down here. I don't know how I can make this bigger. Oh, there it is. Okay. So down here, you see we got Bob with an ID of 1, and we got all of his cars. So when we do the same thing, we want to get the second user, which was Alice. Here we get Alice and all of her cars. Let's say that we want to change our database and add another column to it, and let's say created at. So we want to keep track of when our users are actually created, when their accounts are created. And we can just go in our schema, add one called here created at, and it'll be type of date time, and you can give it a default value of now, and just like that. And so now let's create a migration. So we can do yarn Prisma migrate dev, and instead of having to wait to give it a name, you can do -- name, and then you can actually just type in a name. So this would be added underscore created at, and then here I want to make sure I spell that right. So here now we have our new migration down here, and you can see the SQL that it ran. And so now when we query for a user, let's get this other user. Now I have to actually run my application again. And now we can run a query for the user 2. And here we see created at. So here, oh, it's actually misspelled. Did I not fix it when I said I would? I guess I didn't save the file. Whatever, you see the point though. You have this new column, and that was pretty easy. You can change the database and still have existing data inside of it. And there's many more things you can do with Prisma. You can do something like find many, and you find more than one, you get an array back. But that's pretty much all I needed to show you just to get you started with Prisma. Personally, I suggest you go over here to their documentation. You just go to their website, you hover over products, click on products, and you go to client. And then here, it'll give you a preview of all the things you can do. So you can find records, create records, update, all these CRUD things. And if you want more information, you can click on get started, and you go over here to CRUD. Here it'll tell you how to do basically very similar things to what I just did. So let's say you want to do find unique. So let's say you only want to find one. Instead of finding the first user that matches, like over here we could have done find unique, and that's probably how you're supposed to do it. So here it's gonna work the same. But my point is that you can see all of their commands over here. And over here on this left side panel, they have how to select, how to work with relationships. So you can just keep growing from here. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something, and have a great day.